Welcome back to the Bravery Blueprint. I'm here with my co-host, Brian Ellis, and we are excited about having Andy Hughes on the show today. Andy's a 30-year veteran of law enforcement. He's a former sheriff, and he's on a mission to inspire future generations of law enforcement. And he's also the co-host of the Shepherd Station podcast, which delivers leadership, insights, and thoughts focused with a biblical worldview. Andy Hughes, how you doing, brother?
Good to see you again, Travis.
Well, man, I was excited that you were willing to come on. I know you got a lot of things going on, and you know your journey in law enforcement from a leadership perspective is so interesting to me. And Brian doesn't even know this story, but you weren't always a sheriff. You were inside local law enforcement, and you made a very courageous decision at a tipping point in your career. Kind of walk us through your career and then that decision point of running for sheriff, and then ultimately, of course, what happened.
Yeah. You know, I'm proud to say I'm a second generation law enforcement officer, and I was actually, I think you know this too, Travis. I was born in a Salvation Army home for unwed mothers, and left there by my biological mother. And 6 months later, I was adopted by a Dothan, Alabama police officer and his wife, and my parents, Billy Ray and Marie Hughes. And you know, it was apparent that I was always going to be a cop growing up. Everybody knew what I was going to be, and it was, you know, everything that influenced my life. And at the age of 18, I started my career as a dispatcher with the Houston County Sheriff's Office. Later worked in the jail. In 1988, I was sworn in as a deputy sheriff, worked in patrol and worked in narcotics there. And in 1990, I left and went to the Dothan Police Department, which is a larger agency with more opportunities for advancement, advanced training, and that kind of thing. So went over to Dothan PD in 1990, made corporal, made sergeant in 94, and I was a sergeant there at Dothan PD in 2006, when there was an opportunity for me to get in the sheriff's race here in Houston County. And there'd never been a Republican sheriff in Houston County before. They were all, you know, old Democrats. But there was an opportunity for me to get in the sheriff's race, and I did, and ended up having to quit my job as a sergeant with the Dothan Police Department to continue my race for sheriff, because I had a chief that was trying to force me out of the sheriff's race because he didn't want me to win.
Well, that's where I think the courageous part of the story is. I mean, there was a question on whether you leaving would not have been retirement, right? Like it was short of 20
Right.
years or something like that.
Yeah, I was short of my 25 years that would be required for state retirement here in the state of Alabama. And you know, I'd already committed to the sheriff's race. I had been selected by the Republican Executive Committee out of some other candidates to be the Republican candidate in the general election in November. And shortly after I was selected for that, my chief at the time, he brought up the fact that he thought that I may be in violation of the Hatch Act. If you're not familiar with the Hatch Act, during partisan elections, you know, if you have any control over any federal money or anything like that, then, you know, you may not be eligible to run in a partisan election. He was trying to pull that out of the hat. Ended up, I asked for an investigation by the Office of Special Counsel in Washington. And on September the 6th, I believe it was, they came back with a ruling that said, you've got two choices. You can either drop out of the race, or you've got to quit your job as a sergeant with the Dothan Police Department. And I had 16 and a half years in at the police department. Prior to that, I had another little over 4 years in with the sheriff's office. So I was I was still about 4 or 5 years shy of having my retirement time in. So I had to make a decision, but, you know, me and my wife had already talked about it. I already had money that was been contributed to my campaign. I was in 100%. So, you know, I gathered up all my belongings. I didn't say anything to anybody. I called for a press conference the next day at the courthouse. Took everything I had that was owned by the Dothan Police Department, packed it in my car and parked it at the PD, and then went to the courthouse, and we had a press conference. And at that time, I announced that I was resigning from my position as a sergeant with Dothan PD to continue my race for sheriff.
There's a huge. Go ahead, Randy. I'm sorry.
The chief that was trying to force me out of the race, he never thought that I would, you know, drop out of the he thought I would, you know, drop out of the race because I didn't have time to retire. But you know, my wife and I had already made that decision, and we knew what we were going to do when the time came, and we knew what the answer was going to be or could possibly be from Washington. And that's what it came back, that I was going to drop out of the race or quit my job. So I announced to everybody, and I didn't tell him beforehand. I just got up making an announcement in a press conference where we had about 200 people show up. And I said, I resigned my position as a sergeant with the Dothan Police Department to continue my run for Houston County Sheriff.
Well, there's a couple things here I want to unpack. First off, violation of the Hatch Act. You got to give me a break. You were signing overtime slips as a sergeant, so stop with that nonsense. But that was obviously politics are in play. That was the answer they were supposed to give you. You had to. For me, it's a great courageous story, and I wanted to bring it up and let Brian chime in on it, because it's one thing to talk about being courageous. It's one thing to talk about being tough and to make the right decisions at the right time. You had a lot to lose, because first off, a Republican candidate had the chances of a Republican winning that race is slim. You were 4 or 5 years from being able to pull a pension. You had a lot to lose, and there was no hesitation on your part. Now, I want to be realistic with our audience. There may have been no hesitation on your part, Andy, but was there some nervousness on your part, concern? Because courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is working your way through the fear. So I'm sure there was some fear involved in that, because that's why I think courage fails so much, is as soon as people get scared, they revert back to the comfortable part of whatever they're doing. So obviously it had been very comfortable for you to, hey, I gave it a go. DC said this. I've got to watch out for my family and finances and blah, blah, blah. I've got 20 years invested in this profession. So, but you didn't run to comfort. You walked into fear and put your head down and went right through it.
Yeah, it was a big decision. Like I said, my wife and I had already talked about it, and we'd already knew what we were going to do. We weren't going to back down to any kind of political pressure, and I made that decision. My job as a sergeant with the police department was our primary source of income, also. So, and luckily, just thank God that right after that happened, I obtained another job, which I had already applied for prior to getting in the sheriff's race. I was a firearms instructor at the U.S. Army SEER School at Fort Rooker, which is adjacent to our county here. And I went to work out there for a couple of months, teaching pilots how to shoot in the event that they got shot down behind enemy lines. So I did have another source of income. It was very tiring trying to work and campaign and attend events and everything else, but it ended up being worth the sacrifice, because I'm going to tell you, I'm just not the kind of person to back down.
I love it, Brian. What do you got to say about that?
No, I don't know the story, and right off the bat, it's bold, and I love it. It's a very much Smokey and the Bandit, a long way to go and a short time to get there, kind of thing. But Sheriff, I've never met you, unfortunately, but fortunately today. But what I think there's a part of me that goes there had to have been a spiritual component to it in regards to just this, having faith in the fact of, what you believed in, what you wanted to accomplish, really having a clear vision of the runway and why you took the step to decide to get involved in the race. There must have, again, there was something that you wanted to do differently. And you were completely anchored to that, and I give you tremendous praise for having, just like what Travis said, the courage to do that, and just knowing the fact that, hey, something's going to work out in this scenario, because I inherently believe in what I'm doing.
Well, in my opinion, I've said this before a lot of times on our podcast, I don't think that you can have faith in God and have fear at the same time. Faith in God and fear cannot coexist, to a certain extent. Like I said, you just got to go head on into the fear. But, I felt like maybe I was meant to be in this race. I had vocalized to my wife before that, I wanted to run for sheriff one day, but I didn't feel like until I was at least 40 years old that anybody would take you seriously, I don't know what my reasoning was for that, but I was 38 years old at the time that I entered the sheriff's race. But, to go back a little bit further, Brian, and I think I've told you this before, Travis, but the current sheriff, he was a 3-term Democratic incumbent. He was a retired state trooper. He had another individual that was a former sheriff's office employee run against him in the Democratic primary. and the incumbent sheriff only won by 13 votes, which is a very slim margin. Well, there was only one person that had qualified to run as a Republican, and it was a guy that nobody knew. Nobody knew this guy. He did not even have a valid driver's license. Okay. And just this guy just came out of nowhere. No law enforcement experience, no political experience. He paid his filing fee and filed to run as a Republican for sheriff. Did no campaigning or anything. Okay. So by default, he won the Republican primary because nobody else was running against him. Well, one day they find this guy dead in his recliner from a heart attack. So at that point, the Republican Executive Committee has the choice whether they want to either put a candidate up, period, or they put out the word that said, listen, we're seeking a candidate. If you would like to be considered, submit your name. So I did, along with 5 other individuals who were all in law enforcement here in this immediate area, and we had to go before the Executive Committee and give a speech, talk about our vision of leadership and law enforcement. And, they asked us some pretty tough questions and everything. And after we all went before the committee on the first round of voting, I was selected as a candidate. So I kind of felt like, hey, this is where God wants me, and I'm here for a purpose, and I'm not backing down.
So you win the race, Andy, and you walk into this organization, and it has to be a pretty chaotic transition, right? Because that's how sheriff's departments work. Everybody's working for
Right.
one sheriff, and all of a sudden they're working for another sheriff. There's a lot of fear and trepidation. How did you handle the first 100 days? I mean, I've often talked to new chiefs a lot, and they'll ask me these questions. What should I do for week 1, week 2? Kind of walk us through your first 100 days on the job and how that likely sets you up for success in your tenure.
Yeah. Well, I had been at the sheriff's office previously, but I had left there in 1990. So I'd been gone for, 16 and a half years, prior to taking sheriff. So there was probably only 5 or 6 people there at the sheriff's office that I had actually worked with during my previous tenure there as a deputy. So I didn't really know anybody much. So I had to go in. Of course, I went in with an open mind. The sheriff's office, it had typically, the sheriff prior to the one that I defeated, he worked drugs all the time. He was a former alcohol agent, great guy, but he was focused on working drugs and that kind of thing. So nothing really changed in the patrol arena. And then had his new sheriff come in. He was pretty political, not a whole lot, lot of no aggressive enforcement or anything like that. Just kind of trying to make everybody happy and keep a vote, And so when I come in, about the first 30 days, I sit there going, y'all have been doing this how? You haven't been doing this at all? That kind of thing. They had no patrol rifles. One of the first thing I did was spent pistol permit money and bought everybody a patrol rifle, a go bag with 5 extra magazines, and a med kit, an IFAC, to carry with them in their vehicles, that kind of thing. We focused on getting some higher speed training. These individuals hadn't had a whole lot of high speed training either, so I wanted to get everybody up to par on that. I went from being a sergeant on a shift where we had 22 officers on my night shift to having 173 total employees and a $11 million budget. So it was a big transition, and going back to leadership, I tell this story in my Bear the Sword presentation. You've heard it before, but, whenever I was in special operations at Dothan PD, I was in charge of motorcycle unit, canine unit. I was a team leader for SWAT. I had all the fun stuff, man. I had 2 MP5s and, I had a motorcycle and a car and all this. And my captain or my chief would come to me every once in a while and they would say, listen, we need you to do this staff study, or we need you to conduct this budget analysis. And man, I'm just kicking rocks, and mumbling under my breath going, I don't want to do this crap. I want to be doing some of my fun stuff, and everything. And they gave me the stuff to do, and I would spend a week, putting this budget analysis or staff study together for my chief or my captain. And about 3 months after I had been sheriff, and as I was preparing for my first budget cycle with the county commission to request, all of the items that we needed to be funded in our upcoming, budget, I went back. They were both retired, but I went back to that chief and that captain, and I said, thank you for giving me the things that I did not want to do. And I tell people, do the thing in your career, especially if you want to advance, do the things you don't want to do. And if you want to develop your people into future leaders, give them things to do that they don't want to necessarily do. It's going to make them a better cop. It's going to make them a better leader.
Yeah, that's such solid advice, Andy, and we can certainly get comfortable, right? And what we're familiar with. You mentioned the sheriff that just wanted to do drugs or whatever it is, and that's what I see a lot in leadership is they go to the default, whatever their comfort zone is, right? And so, how important was it as you walk through your tenure as sheriff? Because I'm sure that wasn't the only thing you had to learn, right? Because you were there a number of years. Kind of talk about the points in your tenure where you had to really learn something new or get someone and empower people to do it for you.
Yeah. It's changed a little bit in some counties in Alabama, but in Alabama, as a sheriff, uh, a lot of times you're also designated as a guardian or a conservator for people who don't have the ability to manage their own health issues or manage money that they have. They may have a large amount of money they inherited, but they don't have the mental capacity to manage that money, or it may be someone that does not have any living relatives, and they're injured or they're old and they're in a nursing home or whatever the case may be. We had cases where we had a guy, you'd have a guy from Kansas, and he's just he's a hobo, and he's walking through Dothan, Alabama, and he gets hit by a car and he gets disabled. He has no kin that you can find anywhere in the country. And so the sheriff gets appointed as that person's guardian. So whenever I was sheriff, I think there was probably about 8 times that I had to sign a DNR, do not resuscitate order, on someone that I did not know. So, and we had several people that I had a secretary or administrative assistant in my office, and that's all she did was keep up with my guardianships and my conservatorships. And when I was sheriff, I think I had about 45. I had about 3 or 4 conservatorships and probably 42, 43 guardianships that I had to manage also. I had to sign paperwork to admit people into nursing homes. I had to sign DNRs. I had to make decisions that I felt were best for their health or for their financial well-being and all too. So that was a huge learning curve there. And then of course you've got the politics that goes with the office of sheriff. And I tried not to really be a politician. I told people, I said, I'm not a politician. I'm just a cop who happens to be an elected official, and
Yeah.
I didn't really care. I was going to make sure that we did things and that we did things the right way. And, don't be trying to come put political pressure on me, especially after I got my 25 in. I knew my retirement was locked in here. So, don't try to pressure me into doing something that's not right. We had a situation where our county commission chairman had gotten in with a developer, and they were going to bring in this electronic bingo here into our county, since we had a bingo amendment, to play paper bingo. And they tried to bring this thing in. They tried to snooker me into signing some paperwork to, where these people go ahead and get a license to operate and that kind of thing. And some items had not been met as it was laid out in the local ordinance. And I wouldn't sign it. I just told myself, I'm not signing this. It's not right. So, I had some people get a little ill with me about that, but, I just wasn't going to do anything that wasn't right. When you're an elected official, you're a chief, or no matter what rank you are, especially in law enforcement, we're expected to be a little bit better, to have a little bit higher moral standard. And we don't always have that, but, you need to have a set of principles, and you need to have those principles, and you need to stand upon those principles, and you have to be ready not to violate those principles. And if you have some solid principles and decide that you're not going to violate them no matter what, then that's going to make you a better leader.
Well, that's a big thing I want to transition into, Andy, because you talk about principles. And if you were to ask me, and when you see the cowardice in leadership today, you see the weakness in leadership at all levels, not just law enforcement. I mean, look at the political environment, look at the state level, federal level. I mean, we don't seem to have anyone that's able to stand on anything, right? So when we talk about a principle-based approach to leadership, is that the big problem you're seeing? Because let's face it, leadership is different today than it was in 06. We never saw some of the things we see today back then. What do you think has faltered in the profession to create that?
First of all, if you're a leader, the most important characteristic I think that you've got to have as a leader is love. You've got to love your people. Now, every single one of them may not be somebody that you're going to barbecue with during your off time or take family vacations or whatever the case may be. You still got to love every one of your employees, your personnel. You got to truly love them and care about them. And I think that's what's missing a lot of times. We see a lot of leaders that are just trying to punch a ticket. They don't have principles like I was speaking of. They're not going to tell a mayor or a county commission chairman where to get off when they try to get them to do something that violates their principles. They're job scared. A lot of leaders just want to punch a ticket. They want to make as much money as they can. They want to get a new car every couple of years. They want to work towards their retirement, and then they want a high-paying corporate gig after that, and that's what matters. But that's not the mission, and you've heard me say this before, Travis. We need leaders who are more focused on the mission than they are their position. And I think that that's the thing that's missing. Your people, your personnel have got to know that you support them 100%. Now, my mantra has always been stand up for your employees when they're right, stand beside them when they're wrong, and prosecute them when they're criminals. And that's what I always tried to live by. And I had, during my career, I had 4 employees that I had to arrest and put in jail, and I put every single one of them on the front page of the paper the next morning and said, hey, this is what happened. And this is our response as a leadership team at the sheriff's office. But your people's got to know that you support them, and that you're not going to pander to every little community action group out there that has their own agenda.
I'm so glad you said that, Sheriff, because there was times and I've heard it from a number of people in our profession is there's this kind of callousness that happens in management where and some of it you see because people either promote so fast that they never had those scars to and they never got in trouble. They never they've really just never experienced the job how a lot of people are going to experience the job. And so there's this kind of lack of empathy of going, okay, well, I can see how this happened, because not every wrongdoing by a police officer is from this position of this gross act of like evilness, or you did something so terrible. Right. Sometimes it's just a matter of I didn't know any better. I'm acting in the moment, and I did stupid things. Or I didn't have the experience or the emotional regulation to be a little bit more patient and provide the best customer service. But then you see these some people, and I don't like the word leaders. I just recently had this exchange online of I'm no longer going to use toxic leadership because it's a paradox, right? I'm going to say bad bosses, toxic bosses. There's no more toxic leadership in my right. playbook anymore. We're just going to call them toxic bosses, because leadership is a verb. It's an action. You got to do it. And if you're toxic, then you're not doing leadership. So it's but the callousness of people in those positions and how it impacts organizations. And so I love the fact that you say it comes from love, because everybody can know that they're going to get a fair shake when they know their organization loves them. So I'd love for you to kind of expand on that topic, because I don't think it can be overemphasized. I don't think we can talk about it enough.
No, I mean, first of all, to be a law enforcement officer, you need to have a servant's heart, and I think that we're going down a road where we're seeing a lot of agencies, and they're just recruiting blindly. Man, they're out there making big promises, paying big money, giving big benefits, and they're just recruiting people blindly. And then they're finding out that these people are not making the best cops. They were not the best candidates. I think the first thing we have to do is we have to inspire future generations of law enforcement officers. And that's our job as current and retired law enforcement officers. And I heard so many officers say, especially since 2020, and we're our biggest enemy sometimes. these officers would say, I wouldn't encourage anybody to get in law enforcement today. Well, what are we going to do when we run out of cops? Where are you going to get future generations of law enforcement officers if we don't inspire them? And if we don't inspire them and we just recruit, then are we getting people that are really cut out to be law enforcement officers? You got to have that servant's heart, and that's going to come from love for people. One of the things that I think I could probably be most proud of during my career is if you went back and found anybody that I had disciplined or counseled for any kind of uh, uh, issue as a sergeant at Dothan PD, as a sheriff, or as the chief of tactical operations for the state of Alabama, I don't think you would find anybody that would say that I was mad with them, that I was angry whenever I disciplined or counseled them. Let's sit down, let's talk, let's figure out what happened. Let's talk about whether this was really stupid or not. And let me pat you on the back and say, serve you 3 days off, whatever. Get back, get your head screwed on straight, and let's get back there and get back to work. And, discipline, especially, in law enforcement or any other career actually, but it should never be about anger. It should never really be punitive. It's a learning thing. It's a learning experience there. Of course, there's some people that you have to fire. I've had to fire people before too, and it's not a pleasant thing to do, but that's why you get paid the extra money. And it's like I always try to say too is, anybody can be a leader in a moment where leadership is needed most too. True leaders don't always have stars or bars on their collar or stripes on their sleeve.
Yeah. So, I mean, I had this talk just with somebody last week from an agency who's struggling because they're a manager in a big organization. They're having a retreat with all the managers. The chief had this new technology where she could put up everybody could text from their phone up onto a screen to say, hey, you wanted to ask some anonymous questions about their current culture, and they got hit hard, right? Toxic, good old boy. Like there was not a positive thing that went on the wall. And the first response from that was outrage. It was, we have a lot of work to do. And it wasn't, and I know, cause I know several people in this organization, and they're like, we're all scared. We're scared because we work in this retaliatory environment. What advice do you have, to people that might find themselves in that situation where, it's one thing to work for a really good boss, but man, when you don't, it's not like we work at Wells Fargo one day and we can go put an applicant at Bank of America. It's not easy to make those transitions, especially the more time we have in this career. But what advice would you give people if they found themselves in those types of situations?
Leadership should never be about creating followers. It should always be about creating future leaders. We're not always going to be in a position. I'm not in the leadership positions that I once was. So it's your job as a leader to cultivate people that can take your place. And you can't do that by consistently pushing people back down. You've got to encourage them. Some of the best ideas I've ever heard came from some of the most junior people that maybe had just come into an organization because they weren't so ingrained in that culture of that organization that they actually had a good idea. And this goes back to loving your people also. You got to love them and respect them. Everybody's not going to have good ideas, at either end of the spectrum, whether you're the leader or the newest guy. But we need to cultivate future leaders. And I think if you do that, especially if you look at those people that you can sit there and target and say, this person is going to be a good leader. You can recognize those individuals that are going to be the future leaders of your organization, whether it's a law enforcement agency or not. And if you cultivate and spend a little time with those individuals and help them grow, then you're setting up you're leaving a legacy. I mean, who wants to think about it? Who wants to leave a legacy of this guy was a real butthole? or this lady here just was a toxic leader or toxic boss. What kind of legacy is that for you to be remembered? Do you want people to think when you're gone, like, "Whew, man, I'm glad he's gone, man. He was so toxic, and maybe we can get some air now, and maybe we can make some progress with our agency." Or do you want to be known as someone go, "Hey, this individual came in here, and this chief or sheriff, he really brought in some innovative ideas. He brought our department into the future, and we're sad that he's gone, and we appreciate the legacy that he left." But you got to concentrate on leaving a positive legacy, for your agency and for yourself.
Andy, I love talking to you because you take all of this leadership guru expertise crap that's rolling around out there that tries to complicate things, and you just get right to the heart of it. Hey, do the right thing, have principles, love people.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, yeah. I mean, why is there the disconnect? Because you've actually already mentioned it. You have your leaders that are, I call them the resume leaders. In fact, your quote to me this week when you asked me about one was, "Oh, that's typical. He destroyed the organization, then got him a nice corporate gig." Right. So I understand why the resume leaders exist. It's great for self, me, myself, and I, because the dirty little secret in law enforcement is you can be a terrible person and a terrible leader and achieve great worldly success. But
Right.
you just said the difference right there. It's a choice. Worldly success or legacy. The legacy part is what we're all trying to achieve here. I don't care what's on your resume because more than likely it's all outdated by now anyway. If you came up with some nice little gadget 2 years ago, it's been replaced, right? But what have you invested in people? Is this what we're talking about? Because there's a lack of investment in people. And my theory is that's hard, man. That's hard work to invest in people. It's easy to develop some program or project, especially when you got a team around you, but it's hard work to invest in people.
Yeah, one of the greatest blessings that I have is some of the individuals, and I still live in the community where I worked, in law enforcement. So it's a real blessing to me to have some of the officers that I commanded, deputies I commanded, troopers and all. And when I see them, they say, "Hey, man, we miss you. We really enjoyed the time when you were here, or you showed me this, or you showed me that," whatever the case may be. And that's one of the biggest blessings I think as a leader. Leaders, I fault no one for having a really good career, building a really good resume. I fault no one for having a good, six-figure corporate gig after you retire. I fault no one for that whatsoever. But don't step on anybody else to get there, okay? As long as you've done your job as a leader, as long as you've come up through the ranks, and as long as you've had a positive influence, you're leaving a positive legacy, and you want to go into the corporate world and make some big money in addition to retirement, hey, that's great. I'm proud for you. But don't step on other people, and don't be toxic on your way to do that.
Fascinating stuff, Brian. What else you got?
No, I mean it's I don't think it can be overstated because I mean, let's face it. I think from the legacy piece, you can see, at least I've experienced it's, go to any law enforcement memorial during Memorial Week and see what past chiefs show up. It's the ones that that were loved and the ones that did care about people. It's not the ones that were seedy and just did a bunch of awful things, because quite frankly, when you're irrelevant, and we will all be there at one point, you're irrelevant to that profession, then you've got no power left. I mean, I think that's the true call. Is I've been retired for 2 years now, and my phone rings every week from my past profession, and it's a blessing and a curse.
Yeah.
But I also know other people who haven't talked to a single person because nobody wants to talk to them anymore because they just drove people nuts their entire time, under their control.
Right. Back in 2011, not long after I'd started my second term as sheriff, I started an event where we invited, if you had ever been a law enforcement officer, whether you were municipal, county, state, federal, any position in law enforcement that you'd ever served in our area here, I got some business people to sponsor this, and I would have a retired law enforcement luncheon every year in May during Police Officer Memorial Week. And we would bring in all the retired guys. And man, the first year that we had this, and like I said, I grew up in law enforcement, so I knew a bunch of the really old guys from like the 70s and all. And it was really more. I told them, I said, this is more for me than it is for you guys, because, I saw people that I haven't seen in 20 and 30 years. And those people saw each other that they never ran into for 20 or 30 years while they were retired. Man, it was just really a blessing to see all those retirees come to that lunch one time a year and congregate for 2 or 3 hours and feed them a good meal and that kind of thing. And that luncheon we started in 2011. It's still going on today. Every May, still have that. And all. But that's just part of loving your people, though. It is. There's 4 characteristics in my Bear the Sword presentation that I say that every law enforcement officer must have in order to be effective. And I think the same goes for leadership. And those 4 characteristics are commitment, courage, integrity, and compassion. And I give examples for each of those. But I think those are 4 things that you've got to have to be effective as a law enforcement officer, because we all know those cops. If you don't love people, you're going to have a pretty bitter career. You're going to be cynical. You're going to be ill when you come home every day because you've had to deal with people and that kind of thing. But you got to have that true love for people, and you've got to have commitment, courage, integrity, and compassion in order to effectively do your job as a law enforcement officer or as a law enforcement leader.
What I love about you, Andy, is you got such a wide and varied career. You've impacted so many people, but just because you're now retired from the profession, I feel like sometimes you're just getting started. I know that's sometimes a battle because you're not in the profession, but you still are. So you've got your seminar that you've mentioned a couple of times, and then of course you are the co-host on the Shepherd Station podcast. Talk to us about both of those things and how that's impacting the profession.
After I don't think we discussed this, but in 2014, I was about to run for sheriff for my third term. I was actually unopposed, and I had the opportunity to be appointed as the Assistant Director for Homeland Security for the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency. And I was what they call a chief at that level, some major position. And I was over SWAT, aviation, and EOD for the state of Alabama. Served there for about a couple of years and then retired. Well, I came back and ran for sheriff in 2018 after I retired in 2016. And guess what? The people didn't elect me again. They didn't want me back as sheriff, I guess. They thought, well, he left, and if he wanted to be sheriff, he should have stayed here. My viewpoint was, hey, I'm getting more experience at a higher level. I can come back and be a better sheriff. But it ended up not working out. I didn't get reelected. So after that, man, I was really, I don't get depressed, but man, I was kind of down in the dumps. I'm like, what is my purpose in life now? What am I supposed to do? I was a cop for 30 years and, I was running for sheriff again and didn't work out for me, but, what's my purpose? And so, God revealed to me that my new purpose in life was to inspire future generations of law enforcement officers, law enforcement leadership, and supporters of law enforcement. And he gave me this Bear the Sword presentation. It's about a 45-minute long presentation, and I've had the opportunity to do it several times at several different venues around the country. And that's what it's designed for, is to inspire others to be law enforcement officers, to be better leaders. And, we want people that support good law enforcement out here in America too. We've got to have law enforcement, but we just don't need cops. We need good cops. We need cops with integrity. We need cops with a good work ethic. We need cops that love the people that they serve and the people that they serve with.
Well, the presentation's phenomenal, Brian. I'll just mention the presentation real quick. It's phenomenal. I've seen it a couple of times. It's one of those presentations that you can watch multiple times and you get additional information out of it. Like we just went and saw, I shouldn't tell on myself, the Deadpool movie for the second time. I know Andy's going to give me a hard time for saying that, but the second time around, we saw more things. And that's way, not that Andy's presentation is like Deadpool, but it's a presentation that the more you see it, the more you get out of it. And that speaks volumes for what you're doing there, Andy. Brian, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the fact that, I think sometimes we all forget to the degree of how noble the job is, and the responsibility. It's funny. I don't necessarily know how much that people sit with that oath that they take, when they get sworn in, and how big of a deal it is. It's a big deal. You're being bestowed, the power over other human beings, and to have this delicate balance of spirit of the law versus letter of the law, and it's noble. Not everybody that applies to become a public servant gets to be a public servant. I mean, and a lot of people don't apply because they know they can't do it. So I mean,
Right.
I think if I remember correctly, it was one out of every about 100 people that applied got hired. In my old agency. So you should be awfully proud of the work that you get to do, and it doesn't come without mistakes. I mean, we're all human, and we hire people when they're young, and so you kind of level out the older you get, but at the same time, you do have to have this tremendous love of people, and so I appreciate you continuing that message, because more people really need to hear it. And I think that in this pivotal time where we do need people that are more spirit of the law oriented in a world that's constantly looking over your shoulder, and putting this pressure of, well, I can't bend the rules to do the right thing.
Right.
I think sometimes in this whole accountability push that we've lost the sense of what accountability really means. So my hat goes off to pushing that message forward.
Law enforcement is a noble and honorable profession, and it's up to us to keep it that way. If we have chiefs and sheriffs that continue to hire individuals that do not need to be in law enforcement, we're not going to be very known as very noble or very honorable. Look at the deputy that was involved in the shooting up in Illinois a few weeks ago. From everything that I've seen, this guy had a couple of DUI arrests. I think he had worked with 6 agencies in 4 years. I mean, who's the sheriff that hired this guy? I'm just going to call him out. Who hired this guy after looking at a record like that? Don't hire people just because you've got open slots. It doesn't mean that you have to hire somebody to fill that slot. We need to make sure that we're being selective. And I use a little story from the Bible about Gideon, about the selection process during my talk. But and the thing about it is, if we want to see we've already seen a crisis in law enforcement recruiting and retention. If you want to see a crisis in law enforcement leadership, keep hiring like you're hiring now, and give it about 5 or 10 years. And then that's going to be your pool that you're going to choose from for leadership. And then you're talking about being in trouble when you've got people that have no business being in leadership positions, hiring people that have no business being cops. I mean, that's throwing the fox in the hen house right there. And it's going to be a disaster.
So Andy, you're new to the podcast. Andy, you're new to the podcast world. Talk to us about your podcast. It's great, by the way.
Yeah, a friend of mine, Eric Duhane, he was, when I was a SWAT team leader at Dothan PD, he was my assistant team leader. He called me back in October last year, and he said, "Hey, I think the Lord's leading me to let's produce a podcast." He said, "I want to talk about, first responders and leadership and faith and men's issues and some things like that." And he said, "I want you to be my co-host." I said, "Hey, great. I'm all in, So we got started, I think, back in November, and I think we put out about 60 episodes now. We do some full length episodes, and then we do some shorts called Crime Chronicles, which are stories from our law enforcement career. And we've got another guy, a guy named Thomas Brown. He's a local associate pastor at a church, young guy, like 30 years old. So he adds kind of a different perspective, to our old guy perspective. And he's our tech guy too, because me and Eric are just a couple of knuckle draggers, and he handles all the tech work for us. But anyway, I think last week they told me that we'd had over right about 6,000 people that have listened in on some of our episodes, and our our YouTube analytics and our Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all that are coming up. Some of our episodes have had 200 and 300 views and that kind of thing. So it's going good, and we try not to focus on the numbers, but we want to focus on the mission. We want to make sure that we're reaching people and we're talking about subjects that are really meaningful and putting information out there and some advice. And some days we have guests, some days we don't. We've had some pretty good guests from the military and law enforcement world, and and some clergy members come on too and do some episodes with us. So it's going real good, and it's just something that we enjoy doing every single week. But
well, we're not bitter at all. We're not bitter, Andy. We're not one of those guests, but I know you've been trying to get me out to Alabama for a while, so maybe we'll have to make it happen.
I could have already had Travis on, but he wants to come do it in person, and I want him to come do it in person. I'm just trying to get some agencies to let's get him down and train. But Brian, we'd love to get you on one day.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic.
Yeah, check it out.
That's why we most definitely will. I'll do the deep dive. It's really why this relationship between Travis and I started. Is we have this profound love, for the career, for the advancement of the career, and his work in developing people, and then of course my work in our, my product Magnus works in helping just try to keep that constant push of elevating people's game in the space to make them better. Only at the end of the day, that the end result is better communities, and that's what I'm after. I'm after the flourish, every community having the same chance to flourish. Having economic vitality, having safe streets. Just a good place for everybody to raise their families and have. And it all starts with the principles that you said, that this integrity, this courage, the nobility, and making good decisions. Because without it, all those cards fall. And so it's incredibly important. I applaud you for your effort. We need more effort in this push. And again, thank you for your time.
There's a Latin term, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce it because I can't. And I've heard that this term is actually inscribed upon the DOJ building in DC, but I'm not sure about that. But the Latin term translates into, from law and order, everything else flows. And I tell people, think about that. From law and order, everything else flows. If you can't take your spouse out to dinner and feel safe, if you can't take your children to the park and feel safe, if you can't go to the beach or to the lake on the weekend or go to church on Sundays and feel safe, what else really matters in our society? And we've got to create that environment as law enforcement officers. Some of our cities, going back to 2020, some of them with law enforcement resemble third world countries. Some of them still resemble third world countries. Can you imagine a nation without law enforcement? Anarchy and chaos would be the order of the day. We've got to stand the line. And you see a lot of guys, they walk away from the job and say, "Hey, I want nothing else to do with law enforcement." I'm just the opposite. I want to remain relevant as long as possible. I want to try to mentor cops and mentor leaders and pass along things that I've learned and try to inspire those future generations. Because, like I say in my talk, when I think about the past generations of law enforcement officers that have served our great nation, and as I think about the generation that's serving now, and I think about where we're going to find law enforcement officers for the future, I think about the lyrics from an old George Jones song. Who's going to who's going to stand that tall? Lord, I wonder who's going to fill their shoes. And if we don't do something, we're not going to have anybody to fill those shoes, and we need the right people to fill those shoes also.
Well, Andy Hughes, you're playing a big role in that. We can't thank you enough for being here. And if Brian, thank you so much. And if you've been watching or listening, thank you for doing that. Check out our website, thebraveryblueprint.com, for this and more content. Thank you, gentlemen, both of you.